Okay, wishing you a good day for all. And in the first series, we have been talking about how disinformation and misinformation affect to the society in general. But when it comes to the electoral period, it is really matters. So we are going to talk about it elaborately. We have our guest Sarita Irugal Bandara, technical researcher, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, specifically in an election period, how this misinformation and disinformation affect to the electoral period, and what is the view of what do you think about it?
Sure. I mean, misinformation and disinformation, particularly since the ballooning up of social media, like in Sri Lanka and the world over, has posed a direct threat to elections and also democracy and democratic quality. This is particularly because of its ability to influence and impact the outcome of elections. And this is also what the existing laws and regulations around elections also try to mitigate. So, I mean, the problem has only increased in kind of size and volume in the last, I want to say, about decade or two. So there's definitely a very significant impact on elections when it comes to disinformation and misinformation.
So, how we reduce the effect and harm to the society, and what are the strategies that we can use?
Sure. I think in one of the other videos, other resource persons would have spoken about responsible digital citizenship. But I would like to also look at the sort of legal side of it and what remedies are available for people when it comes to tackling disinformation, especially during an electoral period. So during an electoral period, there are several different laws that might apply to preventing but also taking action against disinformation. So depending on which election, there would be a specific electoral act. For example, there's a specific parliamentary electoral act, there's a local authorities elections act, and so on and so forth. But in general, across the laws that apply, with elections and disinformation, there's three specific categories that apply. So the first one, we call them offenses, which can include impersonation, defacing or destroying ballot papers, or revealing ballot papers, creating false ballot papers. So these are very specific election related offenses that fall under these laws that can carry fines and legal penalties. Then the next one is what we call corrupt practices. So corruption includes bribery, threats, and what we call undue influence. Anything that, by undue influence, it means anything that has the impact to change or affect the outcome of an election, right? So these fall under what we call corrupt practices. Then the final category is illegal practices, which includes specifically for media outlets, for publishing houses, publishing of false news or false information, also declaration of electoral expenditure. If you knowingly declare false expenditure reports, these can also fall under the category of illegal practices. So under these three categories, I think broadly we can understand what disinformation can entail during an election. So it can be very personal acts of whether creating or sharing disinformation, but then it will also pertain to institutional liabilities, right? If you're a media house, if you're a publishing house, then you are responsible for what news you report to ensure that what you're reporting is not false, is not manipulated, does not have an impact on trying to change the outcome of an election. And then finally, you also have a responsibility if you're appearing for an election as a candidate, then whether it's to do with propaganda, whether it's to do with your electoral expenditures, you have a responsibility to abide by these laws.
Yeah, when it comes to abide by the law, we know that online safety bill have been passed by the legislature, but if we are not going to act, but still we can have a dialogue in between the state and the citizen. So how are we gonna deal with these things? Shouldn't we have a dialogue in between the state and the citizen?
Sure. I mean, I think the Online Safety Act is a very specific law that was brought about within a very specific political context, right, in 2024. So when this bill was enacted, civil society, including myself, like a lot of people who work on not just elections but also on freedom of expression, on human rights, on the rights of minoritized groups in this country, were very vocal about the significant impacts it would have on freedom of expression, right, of everyday people. And if you look at the act, it has very broad provisions on prohibited and false statements, most of which haven't even been defined properly. So to me, the Online Safety Act is this manifestly problematic piece of legislation. And on top of that, we've also had issues in actually enacting it, because it requires this Online Safety Commission, which 2 years on since its passing has not been set up. So the law also hasn't been actualized in a proper way, but perhaps that's a good thing. I do think, I mean, this government has also said that they would repeal this law, then they've changed their mind and now they've said they'll amend it, but it's in the amend process, so we don't know where it is. I do understand the need for a law on disinformation, particularly in times of elections. However, what I disagree is on two main counts. The first one is if it is on personal liability, which the Online Safety Act is a criminal law. It's a very personal, it's a law that's on very personal liability, right? But it sets like fines for up to 5 million, prison sentences of up to 5 to 7 years. To me, these seem very excessive, particularly when there can also be provisions for, you know, content removal and things like that. And then on the second point is that the law does not address social media companies and their responsibility in ensuring that disinformation, hate speech, whatever category of problematic content it is during elections, be removed, be prevented from being posted, be labeled appropriately. There's very little discussion of that within the law. So I think there's definitely a space for dialogue, but it has to then also be a collective responsibility to make sure if we come up with regulations that they're actually impactful.
Yeah, and what are the steps that a person who has been aggrieved personally or professionally can take to obtain relief?
Sure. In Sri Lanka, mainly it's civil defamation process that is mainly used, because in 2002 we repealed our criminal defamation provisions from the Penal Code. So what exists now is outlined in the Civil Procedures Act, if I'm not mistaken, and the civil defamation is a fairly individualized process, and it relies on the category of proving that there has been reputational harm and injury caused to you due to a statement that is made and published by a third party, right? So for that, usually you file it with your district court under the proper jurisdiction, and there's a few things you can argue. You can argue that it has caused personal injury to your reputation. Some might also claim that there has been actual loss of income or that there's been financial injury done. So overall, the focus of a civil procedure is not to bring about criminal punishment, right? But it is to convince a judge that you should be awarded damages, is what we call it, right? Compensation for harm done to your reputation. Criminal law, on the other hand, and this is why the OSA can be a bit problematic, because it did introduce a section which can be taken as criminal defamation, like within the meaning of the law, right? Like I believe the exact wording is basically it makes it an offense to communicate false statements that may harm a person's reputation. So under this, that you need to sort of prove that you have to prove that the statement has been knowingly or deliberate or believed to be false that has been communicated, and that it is likely to injure the reputation of another person. So one is, it's quite vague, and the burden of proof is that you have to know like the person's intention, right? And with the way social media functions and with the way everyday people kind of engage with disinformation and misinformation, this becomes quite problematic because there's no surefire way to prove. I think this is different when you consider like media houses or very clearly partisan political parties and like institutions that are partisan. But when it comes to individual people, it becomes quite tricky. And on top of that, we have the idea of the Online Safety Commission, right, which hasn't been enacted. So then even things like interim orders to block or remove content doesn't actually happen. That being said, even within the civil procedure, it is possible to request an injunction to prevent the further spread or dissemination of a defamatory statement or something that is causing personal injury. That is still possible.
So if we talk with examples, so as a socio researcher, so you have been experienced those situations, how the people affected and how vulnerable they are when maybe they do not know about the law or they just publish some things on social media. So if you talk with some examples, what are the situations that have been faced?
I can't think of any specific examples at the moment, unfortunately, but what I can say is that if you think of the criminal defamation provision in the Online Safety Act, right? Because Online Safety Act is a criminal law, first and foremost. If you really think about it, like a lot of the cases that have been filed have been done either by political actors or I think in about 1 or 2 cases, it was like a high-ranking officer in the military, right? So what we are also seeing is that what was passed by the parliament of that time, saying that this is to protect people from disinformation and hate speech, etc. What it has actually been used is for people with access to power, access to political power, being able to enact this law to prevent and block statements that they consider defamatory, which in reality might really be people exercising their freedom of expression, right? If I'm not mistaken, the one case that I mentioned where it was a high-ranking military officer, that complaint was made because there was mention of war crimes, right? So talking about war crimes is not a defamatory statement. That is somebody's freedom of expression in this country where a lot of things about memory and conflict are contested. So what I think, while I can't think of like specific examples right now, what we are really seeing is that the caliber of people who are able to actually access this law and file complaints have been people with a lot of power, who are already protected, who also have a higher threshold to meet when it comes to freedom of expression. If you are a political candidate and if you are running for politics, like there's a higher threshold for you to be held accountable, to be criticized. I'm not saying it's a free-for-all for defamation, but there is a higher threshold. But with criminal defamation, we are seeing that slowly being subverted.
Yeah. So next question is, can the legal powers and technical process be explained to remove false or on a social media?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Like Facebook, Twitter, whatever.
Sure. With social media companies, I think, I'm sure a lot of our listeners would know that you have the report function, right? And especially for disinformation, right now you report it under false information category. During election times, usually social media companies, at least the ones that work fairly closely in Sri Lanka, which is Meta is one of them, right? They enact what is called break the ceiling protocols, which means that they really kind of try to enhance their moderation practices to take down content which specifically falls under our election laws. So anything that can affect the outcome of an election, right? Because remember, election laws consider this like disinformation as far as it's kind of prioritized. The highest priority content is things that might affect the outcome of an election, right? So those things are also should be considered as high priority even by these social media companies. So technically, they should be enacting this break the ceiling protocols. to kind of take down especially posts with false information about things like polling locations, dates, pictures of false ballot papers, if there's any kind of reporting and social media posts around bribes and like corruption scandals, things like this, they need to be proactive in taking down, and you can report it, right, under the specific categories. Then the other thing you can do, for example, on WhatsApp, I think WhatsApp is one of those platforms where it's really tricky to really report it to authorities, right? But in Sri Lanka, you can report it to your third-party fact checkers that work with Meta. I think in Sri Lanka, I believe it's Fact Crescendo, right? So they have a hotline that you can usually escalate cases to. You can report the user, you can report the content. Other than that, you know, social media companies have a massive responsibility to actually take down disinformation. But of course, I think there's still a lot of improvement to be had, especially when you consider Sinhala and Tamil language content, right, which is very under-resourced. The other thing, of course, is that in an ideal world, if we had the Online Safety Commission, you can kind of report it there where they take a judgment, but we don't have that system in place. Legally then, the process is you can go the civil defamation route, or you can, if you want to take the criminal route, and again I'm going to caveat this by saying that this is not a good piece of legislation because of its sort of criminal penalties. That being said, you can, if you want to, take a course through the Online Safety Act. I believe it's from section 12 to 32, there's a bunch of different ones. You can take action under that for false statements.
So what is the legal process available to like obtain compensation against false information?
I mean, the legal process is like I
spread
said.
those things.
So if you go the civil route, it's the damages, right? And you go to like your district court. If it's a criminal case, then you have to go through the magistrate court, and they might escalate it higher. But criminal process, I think there's also penal code amendments that we've had for much longer, which deals with sort of false information. But criminal procedure is, I mean, it's what we usually do. Like you get a lawyer, you file it at the police, and then it goes to magistrate court. And then there it's more punitive damages. It might take a bit longer, and it is punitive damages, and there is a punishment element. But with civil defamation, it's usually just damages.
So can an ordinary person get into legal trouble by unknowingly sharing disturbing such things, like do not aware of the laws or do some things?
Okay. My personal belief is that in practice, that should not be the case, because our criminal law actually does state, right, that you have to prove an intention, especially when you consider elections. There needs to be an intention that you can prove that they are trying to alter the outcome of an election, that they are attempting to kind of defame a person and cause injury, that they are attempting to change an electoral result, right? And these are not very easy things to prove. And so I don't think anybody who unknowingly kind of shares it, especially during an electoral period, should be held criminally liable for it. I do, however, think that it is your responsibility as a citizen, and within sort of responsible digital citizenship, that you do your bare minimum and due diligence to make sure what you're sharing is accurate, whether it's from verified sources, right? Double check with institutions like the Election Commission, right? These are your sort of individual and collective responsibilities as a society. I don't think that people should be held criminally liable for it, right? Like, for example, best one I can think of is like WhatsApp groups, right? Like during election times, WhatsApp groups are inundated with messages. And a lot of those don't come with bad intention. It's just a very like politically charged time, and people just share whatever, you know, sensational thing without actually checking. Do I think it is quite, how do we say, like, that it is quite short-sighted and maybe poor thinking, poor decision-making? Yes. Do I think they should be held criminally liable? Probably not, because there, I think, is where the sort of freedom of expression threshold gets cut off, right? Because there's no, like, it's hard to tell that there's an intention to cause harm.
Yeah.
right? That being said, I do think like
So you are pointing out that there should be a intention, there should be a specific intention.
More
by
so than intention, I think, especially if you consider like a lot of the actors who are known for spreading disinformation. Like for example, on Facebook, there's a lot of digital personalities whose entire following is built on spreading disinformation, hate speech, propaganda. So these are like repeat offenders, often who also make money out of it, right? A lot of these pages are also now monetized. So people like that, I feel like, yes, there need to be penalty. I think whether that's a criminal penalty or a penalty of some other sort, whether it's a banning, whether it's, getting them removed from the platform, that is up for debate, right? But I do think like there has to be a difference, like a very clear difference between everyday people just sharing news without a clear intention or without like a lot of thinking behind it, versus people who are profiting off of it, whether it's political profit, whether it's financial profit, whether it's to just get engagement, because that's the thing people do, right? They spread a lot of disinformation because it's engagement bait, because people will engage with negative information more than they will with positive information.
So some entities use this disinformation as their profitable business.
Absolutely.
So that is the place where we should address.
Absolutely. And that is also the responsibility is also on the social media companies, right? Because if we repeatedly reported somebody's content as problematic, as harmful, as false information, as sort of inciting, issues between communities, if there's a repeated pattern of them doing it, and the companies still let this person kind of spread this information, still let them be on the monetization schemes, still let them make money off of ads, then that is also on the social media companies, no? That is their responsibility to ensure that this type of content is not propagated any further.
So, according to your point of view, is it feasible to prevent these things in a electoral period, or we should build the capacity from a year or for like months? So don't we have a path to build the capacity or knowledge of the people?
I mean, definitely. I think one of the things is that a lot of the attempts at whether it's building capacity of people or of institutions, usually it happens within a very short time period just before the elections, right? To me, I think it has to be a whole of systems approach, which is to say that these practices, like good digital practices, need to be inbuilt regardless of whether we have an election coming up or not, because it builds up, right? It builds up, and we've seen that especially like in the 2019 elections, right? The amount of hate speech, disinformation that was affecting the Muslim community, that directly resulted in certain electoral outcomes, right? Granted, we had the Easter bombings and emotions were really high, tensions were really high, right? But that does not negate the sort of propaganda that was built during that time period that directly resulted in a very specific electoral outcome and very specific policy outcomes after the fact, right? So we can't then, after an incident, decide this is when we need to capacitate our people to think critically, to investigate your sources, and to do these verification things. These have to be daily practice, and unfortunately we still don't have that, because within our institutions, starting from schools, we don't have any serious consideration of what responsible digital citizenship is. So that capacity building needs to happen since you are very young, especially now when everybody has access to like a digital device. So and a lot of people have access to a digital device without actually understanding how to navigate a digital space and how to navigate a space where there's a lot of people making a profit from spreading lies, from spreading hate speech, from spreading disinformation, from basically just saying anything just to get engagement, because there's a lot of money to be made.
Yeah. So can elaborate some global examples how to retain prevent those disinformation, or America, or what are the global examples that you can share with us?
Okay, I can actually think of a local example, if that's applicable. This is not pertaining to elections, but this is an example of how communities and organizations can come together to prevent violence and disinformation from spreading further, right? I believe it was a few years ago when, I forget this gentleman's name and I'm very sorry, there was a Sri Lankan gentleman who was murdered in Pakistan by a lynch mob at a factory, right? And it was very graphic. We saw the videos, it was very graphic, and tensions were immediately high, right? Because, and then immediately, like within minutes of this video circulating around, we had people calling for violence on the Muslim community. We had people sort of saying this is why we should be violent to the Muslim community. There were people kind of spreading disinformation about the Quran, and there was a lot of sort of immediate animosity, right? So in the heat of that moment, there were a few organizations and individuals who came together and who within with a small WhatsApp group, right, decided, okay, how do we systematically report these incidents to Facebook, to YouTube, to the social media companies, right, and make sure that they are taken down immediately. How do we then get the social media companies to take preventative action, right, where like if people try to re-upload that video, can they prevent it from happening? So I think that those types of efforts can really prevent incidents from blowing up and from, blowing out of proportion. And in Sri Lanka itself, we have a lot of examples of social media being at the root of a lot of incidents of violence and harm to people and communities. So I think we don't even need to look at international examples. We can look at local examples. I think we have a lot of local expertise and resources. One of the problems, however, is that those resources, I feel like we don't have enough resources. I think we definitely need a lot more resources, particularly for institutions like the Election Commission, which I believe needs resources regardless of whether there's an election coming up or not. That resourcing needs to be maintained, continuously. And the second one is that there needs to be a lot of cross-agency communication with the Election Commission, and then also, fact-checking organizations, social media monitoring organizations, research organizations, human rights bodies. Like, these dialogues need to happen continuously and not just when there is an election.
Yeah, that's right. And what is the relief that a candidate is entitled to under the election law if false propaganda is, more about the character of a candidate? So yeah, how what I also added to that question, when it comes to the candidates' roles in a election period, so what is the responsible of a candidate specifically in an election period?
Sure, maybe I'll start there and then go into the next part. Yeah? So I think for electoral candidates in Sri Lanka, one is they need to abide by the electoral law. Election law is not just for voters, it's also for candidates. So candidates have a responsibility, like one of the main things is accurately declaring your assets and your expenditures, right? That is like one of the main things. Then the other one is what we in general call like negative marketing, which can fall under corruption practices and then offenses, right? So it is understandable that when campaigning happens that you will kind of attack the other party, attack your opposing candidate, all of that, right? Like these are very, I guess, like very normalized in Sri Lanka. But I think when it comes to false advertising, you can be held legally liable under the electoral law if you can prove that there was an intention to try and change the outcome of an election, and if you knew that this was a false statement to be made. So candidates have a very strong responsibility to ensure what we call some level of ethics. This also means things like gendered hate speech, right? Gendered discrimination. Like these things still fall under, I believe, like the media guidelines, for example, right? It's your responsibility then as a candidate to abide by those. If you are a candidate and you are unfairly targeted by propaganda, then the election law still applies, especially the sections on corrupt practices, right? Where if you can prove that this is a false statement that is made by you, by a specific, person or institution, and that there is an intention to change the outcome. An example I can give is if there's a false information that's flowing saying a certain candidate dropped out of the election or withdrew from the election, that can seriously impact the outcome of an election, because people might think, we don't need to vote for them because they dropped out. So that is a very serious thing that can impact the outcome of an election, right? So in situations like that, you can actually, file a complaint to get some redress. And I believe redress can include sort of fines, but also penalties where you can't vote for the next 2 years, or it might be a prison sentence, things like that. So the courts may grant certain relief. So one could be there's a declaration that the election is void because they consider that the false statement made has materially already affected the result. So then they can say this election is void because it has already impacted the outcome, right? Or they can say that you set aside the election of the opponent. They can say this opponent is now barred from running for this election because they have engaged in unfair practices. So there's several different things, but these are up to the courts to really decide and apply the law.
So yeah, we talk so many things. This is very important to get a momentum, specifically when it comes to electoral period, and people need to be aware of the laws and those things. So thank you for having us, Sarita Irugal Bandara. So keep go on your way and continue your service to the country, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Yeah. So we have been talking about the misinformation and disinformation in an election period, and also we were able to get some insightful information from Sarita Ilugal Bandar, and in the next episode we talk these things elaborately, and thank you for having us. Have a good day.